There is a brutal distance between knowing the name of something and understanding what that something actually is. Most people live in that distance their entire lives, accumulating words, memorizing formulas, repeating concepts they've never rebuilt with their own hands. They call it learning. Feynman called it illusion. The illusion begins early, when we're children sitting in classrooms, when we first confuse memorization with comprehension, when we learn to repeat correct answers without understanding the questions. We're rewarded for this performance, praised for reciting what we've never truly grasped. And so, we continue, year after year, building towers of knowledge on foundations of sand. The paradox is devastating. Most people never learn anything real because they never admit they don't know. They mistake the map for the territory, the label for the thing itself, the equation on the page for the reality it describes. They carry around the vocabulary of understanding without possessing its substance. And because everyone around them is doing the same thing, the illusion remains invisible. We live in a world where people confuse eloquence with comprehension, where sophistication masks emptiness, where the appearance of knowledge has become indistinguishable from knowledge itself. Richard Feynman discovered this early. At Princeton, surrounded by some of the brightest physics students in the country, he noticed something strange. His colleagues could recite complex equations, could perform mathematical manipulations with impressive fluency, could speak the language of theoretical physics with confidence and grace. But when he asked them to explain what the equations actually meant, to describe the physical reality behind the mathematical abstraction, they faltered. They could translate the symbols from one form to another, but they couldn't reconstruct the thinking that had generated those symbols in the first place. They knew how to manipulate the tools without understanding what the tools were for. Feynman realized that what he was witnessing wasn't intelligence or mastery. It was performance, erudition disguised as understanding. And in that moment, something crystallized in him, a refusal, a boundary he would never cross. He couldn't live carrying concepts he didn't fully understand. It wasn't about being smarter than his peers. It was about being more honest. The technique that would later bear his name didn't emerge as a formal method, as a study hack, as a productivity tool. It emerged as an existential necessity, a way of surviving intellectually without drowning in the weight of fake knowledge. The technique itself seems almost absurdly simple. Take a concept you think you understand. Try to explain it as if you were teaching it to a child, someone with no background, no technical vocabulary, no prior assumptions. Use only plain language, simple words, clear logic, and watch what happens. Watch how quickly the explanation falls apart. Watch how the clarity you thought you possessed dissolves into confusion. Watch how the gaps appear, the places where you can't quite connect one idea to the next, where you have to suddenly use a technical term because you don't actually know what it means, where the logic breaks down because you've been relying on memorized steps rather than genuine understanding. This isn't simplification. This is the test. If you can't explain something simply, you don't understand it. Not because simple explanations are sufficient for all purposes, but because the act of simplifying forces you to confront every assumption, every logical leap, every piece of understanding you've borrowed rather than built. When you try to teach something to a child, you can't hide behind jargon. You can't skip steps. You can't gesture vaguely at complexity and hope the listener fills in the blanks. You have to reconstruct the entire path from ignorance to knowledge, and in doing so, you discover whether you ever walked that path yourself or whether you just memorized the landmarks someone else described. At Los Alamos, working on the Manhattan Project, Feynman was surrounded by the greatest physicists in the world: Oppenheimer, Bethe, Teller, Fermi, giants of theoretical physics. And yet Feynman stood out, not because he knew more, but because he asked better. While others would hide gaps in their understanding behind sophisticated language, behind appeals to authority, behind the assumption that someone else had surely figured out the difficult parts, Feynman would dismantle problems down to their essence. He would ask the questions that seemed too simple to ask, the questions that revealed how little anyone actually understood beneath the surface. This required a particular kind of courage, the courage to appear simple, to risk looking ignorant, to choose clarity over the performance of brilliance. Because in academic environments, especially among the intellectually elite, there's tremendous social pressure to appear knowledgeable. Asking a basic question can feel like admitting weakness. Using simple language can seem unsophisticated. But Feynman understood something his colleagues didn't. The only thing more dangerous than ignorance is the illusion of knowledge. At least ignorance can be fixed. The illusion of knowledge calcifies, becomes identity, becomes something you defend rather than examine. The mechanics of the technique reveal its deeper purpose. You choose a concept, you open a blank page, you begin to explain in writing using only simple language. No jargon unless you can define it, no skipped steps, no borrowed phrases, just your own reconstruction of the idea from first principles. And immediately you hit walls. You realize you can't explain why something is true, only that you've memorized that it's true. You find yourself about to write a technical term and then realizing you can't actually define it. You discover that the concept you thought was solid is actually held together by a web of vague associations and half-remembered fragments. So you stop. You go back to the source material, the textbook, the lecture notes, the original paper. But this time, you're not reading to memorize. You're reading with laser focus on the specific gap in your understanding. You're hunting for the logical connection you're missing. And when you find it, you don't just read it, you rebuild it yourself. You write it out in your own words. You work through the logic. You test whether you can now explain it without looking at the source. This cycle, explain, identify gaps, study, rebuild, isn't a study method. It's a ritual of intellectual destruction and rebirth. Each time you fail to explain something, you're creating a map of your hidden ignorance. And each time you successfully rebuild that understanding, you're transforming borrowed knowledge into something you genuinely own. This is what Feynman called the law of learning, though he never formalized it that way. There is no shortcut between not knowing and knowing. You only truly learn what you can reconstruct alone, without support, without jargon, with nothing but the naked logical structure. Everything else is performance, mimicry, cargo cult knowledge. The danger of beautiful explanations is that they seduce us. They sound so complete, so elegant, so satisfying that we mistake the aesthetic pleasure of hearing them for the actual work of understanding them. We fall in love with the way an idea sounds without ever possessing its substance. And because we're surrounded by other people who are doing the same thing, we never notice. We build entire careers, entire fields of study, on foundations of shared illusion. Feynman saw this most clearly when he identified what he called cargo cult science, research that had all the appearance of scientific inquiry without its substance, experiments designed to look like science, papers written in the language of science, conferences where people performed scientific discourse, but without the underlying commitment to truth, without the willingness to discard beautiful theories when they failed to match reality, without the humility to admit when something wasn't understood. The Feynman technique is the antidote. It forces you to distinguish between performance and substance, between knowing about something and actually knowing it. And this distinction matters far beyond physics. In business, people build strategies using impressive frameworks they don't understand. In relationships, people use psychological concepts they've never examined. In art, people imitate techniques without grasping their purpose. Everywhere, the same pattern, the appearance of knowledge replacing its reality. But there's a cost to this honesty. There's a loneliness that comes with refusing to pretend. While 99% of people build identities on superficial knowledge, while they bond over shared illusions and mutual performances of understanding, the person who practices Feynman's technique inhabits different ground, more arid, more real, but isolated. Because once you've experienced the difference between really understanding something and merely seeming to understand it, you can't unsee that difference in others. You hear people speak confidently about topics they clearly haven't examined. You watch experts hide behind jargon when challenged. You see the elaborate social dance of intellectual performance, and you can't quite participate in it anymore. This isn't superiority, though it can look like it from the outside. It's just a different relationship to knowledge, one that prizes truth over comfort, clarity over sophistication, honesty over belonging. Feynman himself was often seen as arrogant, as someone who delighted in exposing others' ignorance. But those who knew him well understood something different. He wasn't interested in hierarchy, in being the smartest person in the room. He was interested in reality, in what was actually true, in stripping away every layer of pretense until only structure remained. And sometimes that meant saying, "I don't know," more often than his peers. Sometimes it meant asking questions that seemed embarrassingly basic. Sometimes it meant choosing isolation over the camaraderie of shared illusion. The transformation happens in the reconstruction. After you've dismantled a concept, after you've identified all the places where your understanding was hollow, after you've gone back to the sources and rebuilt the logic piece by piece, something remarkable occurs. You don't just understand the concept now, you possess it. You can play with it, see how it connects to other ideas, apply it in novel context, question its limits, extend it in new directions. This is what distinguishes genuine understanding from memorization. Memorized knowledge is brittle, fragile, context-dependent. You can recall it under the right conditions, in the right format, but it doesn't generalize, doesn't transfer, doesn't grow. Reconstructed knowledge is alive. It's part of your cognitive architecture now, integrated with everything else you truly understand. You can approach it from any angle. You can explain it in multiple ways. You can see what it illuminates and what it leaves in shadow. This is the freedom that comes from real comprehension, the lightness of not carrying dead weight, the joy of ideas that are tools rather than burdens. Feynman experienced this constantly. Physics wasn't something he knew, it was something he inhabited. He could move through physical concepts with the same fluidity that a musician moves through scales, not because he'd memorized more than his colleagues, but because he'd rebuilt more, owned more, integrated more. The technique doesn't put you ahead of 99% of people because it makes you smarter or faster or more impressive. It puts you ahead because it moves you into a different reality entirely. A reality where ideas are solid structures rather than beautiful mist, where understanding means something more than the ability to repeat what you've heard, where learning isn't about accumulation, but about transformation. Most people live their entire lives without ever experiencing this shift. They collect credentials, degrees, titles, accolades, all while carrying around concepts they've never actually examined. They succeed according to conventional metrics, speak confidently in professional settings, impress others with their apparent expertise. But underneath, there's hollowness, a fundamental disconnect between what they can perform and what they actually understand. Feynman, toward the end of his life, looking back across decades of physics, of teaching, of explaining, recognized that his technique had never been about efficiency or competitive advantage. It had been about integrity, about refusing to lie to himself about what he understood, about choosing the harder path of genuine comprehension over the easier path of sophisticated ignorance. And he recognized that this kind of intellectual honesty, though it seemed like a narrow technical choice, was actually a form of freedom. The freedom to think for yourself, the freedom to question authority, the freedom to rebuild the world from first principles rather than accepting it as handed down. This is what separated him from his peers, not intelligence, but liberation. So the question echoes forward, from Feynman to us, simple and devastating. What do you actually understand? Not what you can recite, not what impresses in conversations, not what you've memorized or borrowed or performed, but what you can reconstruct from zero, with your own words for someone who knows nothing. The answer, for most of us, most of the time, is uncomfortable. We discover that we're carrying around vast architectures of pseudo-knowledge, beautiful and impressive, and utterly hollow. We've built identities on foundations we've never examined. We've spent years accumulating, without ever truly learning. And the revelation is both crushing and clarifying. Because once you see the illusion, you can't unsee it. Once you feel the difference between fake understanding and real comprehension, you can't go back to the comfort of pretending. Feynman didn't leave us a study method, a productivity hack, a technique for getting ahead. He left us an invitation to a different kind of life, a life of relentless intellectual honesty, a life where learning means something more than performance, a life where you possess your knowledge rather than being possessed by the appearance of it. The choice, as always, is ours. We can continue in the comfortable illusion, surrounded by others doing the same, building towers of sophisticated ignorance that feel like wisdom. Or we can begin today, now, to dismantle the first false certainty, to open the blank page, to try to explain something simply and watch the explanation collapse, to admit we don't know, to go back, to rebuild, to learn finally what learning actually means. The technique is simple, the commitment is brutal, the freedom is absolute. And 99% of people will never attempt it, will never feel the difference, will never know what they're missing. But you're not them, not anymore. The question has been asked, the invitation extended. The only thing left is to choose.